Hey guys, tonight we begin with a physician's ledger that records daily fevers at noon, but the patient died at midnight, which means someone is writing treatments for a corpse or someone is writing fiction in what should be medical fact. This is about royal physicians in 15th century England, those careful recorders who documented every symptom, every treatment, every bowel movement of the king, because royal health was state secret and medical ledgers were legal documents that could prove succession or treason depending on what they showed. It's not about dramatic deathbed scenes or heroic medicine. It's about one winter night when the king's doctor realizes that the medical records he's been writing for months don't match what he's been observing, and what that discovery reveals about how documentation becomes conspiracy, how noting truth becomes treason, and how survival means learning what you're supposed to record versus what you're supposed to see. Before we begin, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who thinks about documentation as political act, about how medical records serve power more than health, about the difference between what doctors know and what they're allowed to write down, you're in exactly the right place. Take a moment to subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments about times you've seen official records that obviously didn't match reality. I'm genuinely curious who joins me for these explorations of how record-keeping creates truth, regardless of facts. Now settle in, and let's discover what happens when a physician realizes his ledgers are lying and has one night to figure out why before those lies become evidence at a trial that could execute half the court. The palace is Westminster in London, and the year is 1483. England is in the middle of a succession crisis that will eventually be remembered as the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, though nobody calls it that yet. Edward IV is king, has been for 22 years, is 40 years old and should be healthy but isn't, has been declining for months. The royal physician is a man named Thomas Morley, who's held this position for 8 years. He records everything, every fever, every cough, every treatment, every meal, every bowel movement. The level of detail is absurd, but necessary. Royal health is state matter. The king's body is political object. What happens to it matters beyond personal health. If the king dies, succession happens, power transfers, people lose positions or gain them, wars might start or end. So Thomas records everything, because the ledger isn't just medical documentation, it's legal evidence, historical record, potential proof in future disputes about whether the king was murdered or died naturally or was too sick to make valid decisions near the end.
Thomas is 43 years old and has been a physician for 20 years. He's good at his job, trained at Bologna, understands humoral theory thoroughly, can diagnose most ailments accurately, can provide treatments that sometimes work and mostly don't harm, records systematically, creates ledgers that are comprehensive and legible and useful for purposes beyond medicine. That's why he's royal physician, not because he's the best healer, though he's competent, but because he's the best recorder. The King's Council trusts his documentation, uses his ledgers to track the king's condition, makes decisions based on what Thomas writes. That trust is about to become a problem.
It's December 15, 1483, late evening. Thomas is in his quarters, adjacent to the king's chambers. He's reviewing the winter ledgers, standard practice. He reviews periodically to ensure consistency, catch errors, prepare summaries for the council. The king has been ill for 3 months, started with chest congestion in September, developed into persistent cough, then fever, then general decline. The ledgers document all of it. Daily entries noting temperature, symptoms, treatments, meals consumed, elimination, sleep quality, comprehensive record of the king's deteriorating health.
Thomas is reading through November entries when something catches his attention. November 23rd. He recorded that the king had fever at noon, temperature estimated high based on skin warmth, pulse rapid, breathing labored. treated with bloodletting and cooling herbs. Patient rested comfortably afterward. Except Thomas suddenly remembers that November 23rd was the day he wasn't present at noon. He was called to attend the Queen, who had fallen. Didn't see the king until evening. Couldn't have taken temperature at noon because he wasn't there. So who wrote this entry? Thomas checks his own handwriting. It's his writing, his style. But he didn't write it. Or rather, he wrote it, but not based on actual observation, based on something else. Report, maybe. Someone telling him what to write.
He keeps reading. November 24th. Similar entry. Fever at noon. Treatments. Comfortable rest. Thomas remembers this day. He was present. The king didn't have fever at noon, had fever in the evening. Thomas recorded evening fever at the time, but now the ledger shows noon fever. The entry has been changed. Not obviously, no cross-outs or insertions, just different from what Thomas remembers writing. Either his memory is failing, possible but unlikely since this was only 3 weeks ago, or someone altered the ledger, or Thomas wrote what he was told to write instead of what he observed. That third option is troubling, because Thomas doesn't remember being told to falsify records, but he also doesn't remember writing these specific entries based on observation. Thomas keeps reviewing, December 1st through December 10th. Every entry shows fever at noon, treatments at noon, comfortable recovery. Standard pattern. Except Thomas knows the pattern isn't standard. The king's fevers have been erratic, sometimes noon, sometimes evening, sometimes none at all for days. The ledger shows perfect consistency, daily noon fevers, daily treatments, daily comfortable recovery. It's too consistent. Real illness isn't this regular. Real documentation of illness shouldn't look this patterned. The ledger is showing what someone wants documented, rather than what's actually happening. Thomas feels cold despite the fire in his room. He's been writing fiction. Not intentionally, not consciously, but someone has been directing what he writes, either through direct instruction that he's forgotten, or through alteration of his entries after he writes them. Either way, the ledger is false. Not slightly inaccurate, that's normal, medicine is inexact, but systematically false, showing a pattern that doesn't exist, recording treatments that may not have happened, creating documentary evidence of reality that isn't real. And Thomas is the one whose name is on it, whose authority backs it, whose testimony will be required if questions are asked about these entries. He stands, paces. His room is small, 10 paces from fireplace to door, back and forth, trying to think through implications. If the ledger is false, who benefits? The king's health is political matter. Documentation of his health shapes what people believe about succession, about his ability to rule, about whether his recent decisions were made by a healthy king or sick king, influenced by advisors. The timing of fevers matters. If the king is sickest at noon, middle of day, when he'd be conducting business, signing documents, making decisions, that suggests his judgment might be compromised at those times. If instead he's healthy at noon and sick only at night, his daytime decisions are valid. The ledger is creating a story about when the king is capable versus incapable. That story has political implications. Thomas returns to the ledger, reads more carefully. The noon fever pattern starts in mid-November. Before that, the entries are varied, accurate to his memory. After mid-November, perfect consistency. Something changed. Someone decided the ledger needed to show specific pattern, either told Thomas to write it or changed his entries. But why? What's the political advantage of documenting daily noon fevers? Thomas thinks about palace politics, about who benefits if the king is shown as incapable during business hours, about who's been making decisions while the king is recorded as feverish. The Duke of Gloucester, the king's brother,
has been handling state business while the king is ill. If the king is documented as feverish every noon, Gloucester's authority to act on his behalf is justified. The ledger becomes evidence that Gloucester isn't usurping power, but exercising necessary authority on behalf of incapacitated king. That makes sense politically, but it also means Thomas's medical documentation is being used to justify power transfer that might not be legitimate. The king might be healthier than the ledger shows, might be capable of ruling, but the written record says otherwise, and written records matter more than truth when succession is disputed.
Thomas sits, returns to the ledger. He needs to know exactly how false it is, needs to understand what he actually observed versus what's documented. He starts taking notes on separate parchment. December 1st, ledger says noon fever. Thomas remembers, actually remembers, not guesses, that the king was lucid at noon that day, requested specific food, complained about boredom, not pain, didn't have fever until evening. December 2nd, ledger says noon fever. Thomas's memory is hazier, but he thinks the king was playing chess at noon. Hard to play chess while feverish. December 3rd through 10th, Thomas can't remember specifics. The days blur. But the ledger's perfect consistency seems wrong. Real illness fluctuates. The documentation should fluctuate too.
If you just felt that recognition of documentation as political weapon rather than neutral record, of how doctors become part of power struggles through what they write down, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way medical records serve politics more than medicine. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want to see how this plays out across one desperate night, and share your thoughts about modern equivalents to this kind of documentary manipulation.
Thomas needs verification, needs to know if his suspicions are correct before he does anything that could be interpreted as questioning the ledger's accuracy. Because questioning the ledger means questioning whoever altered it, and whoever altered it probably has power to destroy Thomas for noticing. He goes to his medical chest, finds his private notes. He keeps rough notes during the day, transfers them to the official ledger each evening. The rough notes are less formal, more honest, sometimes include observations he doesn't put in the official record because they're politically sensitive or medically uncertain. He finds November notes, compares them to the official ledger.
November 23rd. Rough notes say, absent at noon, Queen required attention, saw King evening, fever moderate. Official ledger says noon fever high, bloodletting effective, comfortable rest. The rough notes match Thomas's memory, the official ledger doesn't. So the alteration happened after Thomas made official entries. Someone is accessing the ledger after Thomas writes in it, changing entries, creating false record, and doing it skillfully enough that Thomas didn't notice until now. That's organized conspiracy. Not casual manipulation, but systematic falsification of state medical records. That's serious crime. That's treason if done without royal authorization. That's also exactly what someone would do if they were positioning for succession dispute and needed documentation showing the king was too sick to rule effectively.
Thomas continues comparing notes and ledger. The pattern is consistent. Starting mid-November, the official ledger diverges from Thomas's rough notes, always in same direction, always showing noon fevers that Thomas's notes don't confirm, always showing comfortable recovery after treatments. The rough notes show more varied picture. Some days good, some days bad. Some days the king is lucid and angry about being treated like invalid. Some days the king is indeed quite sick. But the official ledger smooths everything into a consistent pattern that serves narrative about incapacitated king requiring regent authority.
It's now near midnight. Thomas has spent 3 hours comparing documents, has confirmed that the ledger is systematically false, has evidence in his rough notes, now faces decision about what to do with this knowledge.
Option 1. Nothing. Pretend he didn't notice. Continue writing ledger entries as directed, whether explicitly or implicitly. Keep his position, his income, his safety. This is safest option. Whatever conspiracy is happening, Thomas isn't part of it knowingly, didn't intentionally falsify records, can claim ignorance if questioned. Option 2. Report to the council. Explain that the ledger has been altered. Show the rough notes as proof. This is most honourable option, also most dangerous, because whoever altered the ledger has power, probably sits on the council. Thomas's accusation would be heard by the person he's accusing. That's not likely to end well for Thomas.
Option 3. Document the falsification, but don't report it yet. Continue keeping rough notes. Mark where official ledger diverges. Build case. Wait for situation to develop. This is middle option. Preserves evidence without immediate danger. Also most cowardly. Allows conspiracy to continue while Thomas collects proof. But what's he collecting proof for? If the king dies, and he might, his health is genuinely declining, even if not exactly as the ledger shows. The succession will be disputed. The ledger will be evidence. If Thomas has proof that the ledger is false, that proof could be valuable, could protect him if he's accused of malpractice, could be weapon if he needs leverage, could be insurance against being made scapegoat for the king's death.
Thomas chooses option 3, continues documenting the discrepancies. But that means he needs to understand how the falsification is happening, who's accessing the ledger, when they're changing it, how they're doing it without leaving obvious marks. The ledger is kept in his quarters, should be secure. But Palace has many people with many keys. Someone with access is altering it. Thomas needs to know who. Sets up test. Tomorrow? Today, now. It's past midnight. He'll write entry with a specific, unusual detail. Something distinctive enough that if it's changed, he'll know exactly what was altered and can narrow down when the alteration happened.
He goes to bed but doesn't sleep well. Mind is churning through implications. He's discovered systematic falsification of state medical records, is complicit by having written them even if unknowingly, has evidence of conspiracy but no safe way to use it, has position that depends on trust of people who might be the conspirators, is trapped between being faithful physician documenting reality and being political actor recording what serves power. This is what royal physicians face that regular physicians don't. Your patient's body is evidence in political disputes. Your records are weapons. Your observations matter beyond medicine. And you can't just heal, you have to document. And your documentation has to serve purposes you might not fully understand. That's the burden Thomas carries. And tonight, he's realized it fully for the first time.
Morning comes, December 16th. Thomas attends the king. Edward is awake, lucid, complaining about draughts in his chamber, wants fire built higher, wants wine that hasn't been watered down, wants to know why his brother Gloucester is making decisions about taxation without consulting him. The king is clearly aware, clearly capable of opinion about state matters, clearly not the feverish invalid that yesterday's ledger entry documented him as being. Thomas takes temperature by feeling the king's forehead and pulse. No fever. Skin is normal warmth. Pulse is steady, if slightly fast. The king is not actively sick right now. This is the pattern. Days of relative wellness interrupted by occasional fever episodes. Not daily noon fevers followed by comfortable recovery. The reality is different from the documented reality.
Thomas writes in his rough notes, 16 December morning, King lucid, no fever, complained about draughts and wine quality, alert enough to question Gloucester's taxation decisions, skin normal warmth, pulse steady, 70-80 beats per minute estimate. Later he'll transfer this to the official ledger, but he'll write something different. will write what he's supposed to write, what creates the pattern, will document noon fever, whether or not one occurs, because he now understands that's what's expected. The ledger isn't medical record, it's political document pretending to be medical record, and Thomas's job is maintaining that pretense while keeping private notes about reality. That's how he survives, by writing two versions, one true, one useful. He makes rounds of other palace residents who need medical attention, minor ailments mostly, a servant with infected finger, a lady-in-waiting with headache, a guard with persistent cough. These are simper. Their health doesn't matter politically. Thomas can document accurately, can provide treatment based on observation, not politics, can be physician rather than political actor. It's relief to treat people whose bodies are just bodies, rather than evidence. But he returns to the king by noon, standard schedule, needs to be present for the noon observation that will or won't be documented accurately, depending on forces Thomas doesn't fully understand. The king at noon is playing dice with a courtier, laughing, making jokes about the courtier's terrible luck, drinking wine, eating bread, not showing any sign of fever or distress. Thomas observes for 20 minutes, takes temperature again, still normal. The king is having good day, better than he's been in weeks. This should be documented. This should give hope to the council and the court, should show that the king's recovery is possible. Instead, Thomas knows he'll document noon fever, will write that the king required bloodletting, will create false record, because that's what the pattern demands.
He returns to his quarters, writes the official entry. 16 December. King exhibited high fever at noon, skin hot to touch, pulse rapid, breathing laboured, bloodletting performed, 12 ounces drawn. Patient rested comfortably afterward. Evening observation showed some improvement. It's complete fiction, well-written fiction, medically plausible fiction, but fiction nonetheless. Thomas signs it, dates it, closes the ledger, and feels sick himself. Not physically, morally. He's just committed fraud, documented falsehood as truth, created evidence that could be used to prove the king is incapable, when Thomas knows the king is quite capable today. This is treason. If the ledger is used to justify removing the king from power, Thomas is accomplice. If the king dies and succession is disputed, Thomas's false documentation could determine who rules England. That's too much weight for one physician's lies to carry.
Evening comes. Thomas reviews the day's entry, considers changing it back to truth, realizes he can't. If he changes it now, he's admitting the noon entry was false, which raises question of why he wrote false entry, which leads to questions Thomas can't answer safely. Better to maintain the fiction, add to his private notes about the discrepancy, build his documentation of documentation, his record of the false record. That's all he can do now. He's committed, has crossed line from observer to participant, from physician to conspirator, from recorder of truth to creator of useful lies. And he can't go back without destroying himself.
He goes to check on the king one final time. Evening observation. The king is sleeping, genuinely sleeping, not feverish unconsciousness, breathing steady, no signs of distress. Thomas notes this in his rough notes, will write something different in official ledger, will document evening improvement, that's recovery from noon fever that never happened. The lies compound. Each entry makes the next lie necessary. Each false documentation requires supporting false documentation. Thomas is building narrative in ledger that has no connection to reality, but perfect internal consistency. That's what makes it believable. Not that it's true, but that it's coherent. That it tells story that makes sense if you don't know the truth. And only Thomas knows the truth. Only Thomas has both versions. Only Thomas can prove the falsification. That knowledge is power and burden and danger, all simultaneously. He writes final entry for December 16th, closes the ledger, locks it in his chest, though he knows the lock is meaningless if someone with authority wants access, goes to bed, lies awake thinking about how he got here, how he went from trusted royal physician to writer of fiction pretending to be medical fact, how documentation serves power rather than truth, how his careful records that he thought were serving medicine are actually serving conspiracy, how he's trapped now, can't stop writing false entries without revealing he knows they're false, can't reveal knowledge without endangering himself, can't protect himself without continuing the conspiracy. That's how quiet treason works, not through dramatic acts, but through systematic falsification of mundane records, not through violence, but through lying about noon temperatures, not through armies, but through physicians' careful handwriting documenting fevers that don't exist, and treatments that weren't needed, and recoveries from illnesses that weren't happening. The ledger is weapon. Thomas is wielding it on behalf of people whose purposes he doesn't fully understand, and he has no way out except continuing to write lies until whatever the conspiracy aims for happens or fails, and then hoping that whichever side wins will need a physician to compromise to object to whatever comes next. That's survival. That's what noting a secret fever in winter ledgers step by step through long night has taught Thomas. That sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is write down what you observe, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is write down what you don't observe, and you never really know which is which until it's too late to choose differently.
Thomas maintains the false documentation for 2 more weeks, December 17th through December 31st. Every entry shows noon fever. Every entry documents bloodletting. Every entry records comfortable recovery. The pattern is perfect, too perfect. But Thomas writes it dutifully because he understands now that this is his role, not to document truth, but to document what serves whoever's controlling the ledger. He keeps his private notes, records reality and rough parchment that he hides in medical chest. The parallel documentation grows. 2 versions of the king's health, one official, one true. And they're increasingly divergent because the king is actually improving slightly, while the ledger shows consistent daily decline that justifies continued regent authority. On January 2nd, 1484, Thomas is summoned to the council chamber. Not unusual. The council periodically requests medical updates. Thomas brings the ledger, expects routine questions about the king's condition and prognosis. Instead, he walks into a situation that makes him realize the falsification has larger purpose than he understood. The Duke of Gloucester is present, so is the Lord Chancellor, the Archbishop, 5 other powerful men. They're not asking about health, they're asking about capacity. Dr. Morley, based on your daily observations documented in this ledger, is the king capable of making sound decisions about state matters during the hours when he exhibits fever? Thomas understands immediately. They're building case, not for treatment, but for removal. The documented noon fevers justify keeping the king isolated from decision-making during business hours, justify Gloucester's regency, justify whatever comes next. And Thomas's ledger is the evidence. His carefully recorded lies are becoming legal basis for power transfer. He's being asked to testify based on documentation he knows is false. This is the moment. He can tell truth. Actually, the ledger is inaccurate. The king is often lucid at noon, and destroy himself. Or he can support the lie and become fully complicit. There's no middle option, no way to partially participate.
He looks at the ledger in his hands, his handwriting, his signature on every page, his authority as royal physician backing every entry. If he contradicts it now, he's admitting he falsified state medical records. That's treason, punishable by death. Even if he explains he was coerced or misled, he's still the one who wrote it, still the one whose name is on the false documentation. He's trapped by his own handwriting, by the documentation he created thinking he was protecting himself, but actually was creating the chains that bind him to conspiracy he didn't choose.
Based on the documented fever pattern, Thomas says carefully, the king experiences significant impairment during midday hours. His judgment during those periods would be questionable at best. It's not quite lie. The ledger does document that pattern. Thomas is just reporting what the ledger says rather than what he knows to be true. But the effect is same. He's telling the council what they want to hear, providing medical testimony that justifies their political agenda, becoming not just observer but active participant in whatever they're planning. The Duke of Gloucester nods, thanks Thomas for his clarity, dismisses him. Thomas leaves knowing he's just sealed something. Maybe the king's fate, maybe his own, maybe both. He returns to his quarters, sits, stares at the ledger, realizes fully what he's become. He's not physician anymore. He's political instrument. His medical expertise matters less than his willingness to document useful fictions. That's why he was chosen for this position, not because he's the best healer, but because he's compliant enough to write what he's told and careful enough to make it believable. Someone understood this about him before he understood it himself. Someone knew he'd choose survival over truth when forced to pick. And they were right. Thomas just proved them right. Just chose his own safety over honesty. Just became the kind of person he'd have despised a month ago.
If you've been following this journey into how documentation corrupts, how record-keeping becomes conspiracy, how doctors become politicians despite themselves, subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want to see how this plays out, and share your experiences with being forced to choose between career and integrity. I'm genuinely curious how people navigate these impossible positions.
3 days later, the king has genuine fever. Not noon fever documented to justify regency, but actual evening fever from actual illness. His lungs are filling with fluid. He's struggling to breathe. This is serious medical crisis. Thomas treats him aggressively. Bloodletting, yes, because that's standard treatment, but also positioning him upright to ease breathing, warming herbs, keeping him hydrated, monitoring constantly. The king's condition is genuinely dangerous now. He might die. Not from conspiracy, but from medical reality. From being 40 years old and overweight, and having developed pneumonia in drafty Winter Palace. Thomas writes this truthfully in his rough notes, describes the symptoms accurately, documents the treatments honestly. This is real medicine, real crisis, real documentation of reality.
Then he writes the official ledger entry. 3 January. King exhibited high fever at noon, skin hot to touch, pulse rapid, breathing labored, bloodletting performed, 12 ounces drawn. Patient rested comfortably afterward. Evening observation showed some improvement. The same entry he's been writing for 6 weeks. The pattern continues, even though today the pattern happens to be true, or partially true. The king did have fever, just not at noon, and didn't rest comfortably afterward, and evening didn't show improvement, but rather showed deterioration. But the ledger entry maintains consistent narrative regardless of reality. That's how propaganda works. Keep the message consistent. Even when reality momentarily aligns with the message, don't deviate from pattern. Consistency matters more than accuracy.
The king's condition worsens over next week. He's genuinely ill now. Thomas is providing actual medical care, spending hours at bedside, consulting with other physicians, trying every treatment available to 15th century medicine, which isn't much. The king improves slightly, then declines, then stabilizes, then declines again. It's unclear whether he'll survive. Thomas documents all of this faithfully in his rough notes, documents generic, consistent pattern in official ledger. The two versions diverge even more dramatically now that there's actual medical crisis to record truthfully versus fictional medical crisis that's been being documented for weeks.
On January 10th, the king seems to stabilize. The fever breaks. Breathing eases. He's weak but conscious. Asks Thomas direct question. How long have I been this sick? Thomas doesn't know how to answer. According to the ledger, 6 weeks of daily fevers. According to reality, about 10 days of genuine illness. You've had various symptoms for several weeks, Your Majesty, Thomas says carefully, but the acute crisis began 8 days ago. The king nods, seems to accept this, then asks more pointed question. What does my ledger say about my condition? I want to see it.
Thomas panics internally. The king wants to see documentation that shows him feverish every noon for 6 weeks. Documentation that's been used to justify his brother making decisions without consulting him. Documentation that the king will immediately recognize as false because he's been present for his own health. He's been awake at noon most days, knows he wasn't feverish every single day. Reading the ledger will reveal the falsification, will expose Thomas as fraud, will raise questions about who ordered the falsification and why. This is disaster.
The ledger is medical record, Your Majesty, Thomas tries. Technical documentation that wouldn't be particularly illuminating for non-physician. The king is insistent. I want to see what you've been writing about me. Bring the ledger. Thomas has no choice. Retrieves the ledger, brings it to the bedside, opens it to recent entries, watches the king read, watches his expression change from curiosity to confusion to anger. This says I had fever every day at noon for 6 weeks. I wasn't feverish most of those days. I was playing dice, playing chess, meeting with courtiers. What is this? The king's voice is weak, but the anger is genuine. Thomas has been caught, the documentation has been exposed, and Thomas has maybe seconds to decide how to respond.
He could tell the truth, explain that the ledger has been falsified, that Thomas was coerced or misled into writing false entries, that the documentation has been used politically. But that truth implicates powerful people, accuses the Duke of Gloucester or the Council of conspiracy, and Thomas has no proof except his rough notes, which are hidden in his medical chest and would need explanation for why he kept them, why he documented separately unless he knew the official ledger was false, which means he was complicit in falsification, which puts him right back where he started, trapped by his own documentation.
He chooses deflection. The entries record fever episodes Your Majesty may not have been fully aware of due to the fever itself affecting memory and consciousness. The medical observations are technical assessments of body temperature and humoral balance that wouldn't necessarily match your subjective experience of wellness. It's medical nonsense dressed in technical language, hoping the king doesn't understand medicine well enough to see through it. The king stares at him. You're saying I had fever I don't remember, every single day? That seems implausible. Thomas nods gravely. Fever affects memory, Your Majesty. It's not uncommon for patients to have different recollection than medical records show.
The king doesn't believe him. Thomas can see that. But the king is also too weak to pursue this aggressively, too ill to start investigating his own medical records. He waves Thomas away. Get out. Send my brother. I want to talk to Gloucester about what's been happening while I've been supposedly too feverish to remember my own days. Thomas leaves, knows he's just bought temporary reprieve. Once the king talks to Gloucester,
Once the council realizes the king has seen the ledger and questioned it, they'll need to address the problem. Either they'll admit the falsification, unlikely, or they'll silence the questioning, either by convincing the king his memory is flawed, or by more permanent means. Thomas has just lit fuse on explosion he can't control.
He returns to his quarters, grabs his rough notes, the private documentation of reality, considers destroying it. If the ledger's falsification is exposed, having parallel accurate records proves Thomas knew it was false, makes him look guilty of deliberate fraud rather than mistaken medical judgment. But destroying the notes eliminates his only proof that he documented reality somewhere, that he wasn't completely complicit, that he maintained some connection to truth even while writing lies. He can't decide, holds the rough notes, stares at the fire. One step toward the flames and the evidence disappears. One step toward his medical chest and the evidence is preserved but potentially incriminating. He's paralyzed by the impossibility of choosing correctly.
The Duke of Gloucester arrives at Thomas's quarters an hour later. Doesn't knock, just enters with 2 guards. His expression is calm, but Thomas recognizes danger in the calmness. Dr. Morley. The king has expressed concerns about his medical ledger, seems to think the entries don't match his recollection. I assured him that fever affects memory, that his confusion is symptom of illness, that he should trust your professional documentation. He was somewhat reassured, but it's important that we maintain consistent message. The king's memory is unreliable due to illness. Your ledger is accurate medical record. Those 2 statements must be compatible. Do you understand?
Thomas understands. He's being told explicitly what he's been understanding implicitly. The ledger's falsification is deliberate, has Gloucester's authorization. Thomas's job is maintaining the fiction, not questioning it, not allowing the king to question it, using medical authority to override the king's own memory of his own health. That's the conspiracy fully revealed, not implied, not suspected, stated openly. And Thomas is being told his continued employment, his continued life probably, depends on maintaining it. He nods. I understand, Your Grace. The ledger is accurate. The king's memory is affected by illness. I'll communicate that if questioned.
Gloucester leaves. Thomas sits. The rough notes are still in his hands. He looks at them. His actual observations, his truthful documentation, his evidence of medical reality. Then he looks at the fire. The flames are bright, inviting, destructive. He stands, walks toward the fire, holds the rough notes over the flames, feels the heat. This is the moment. Burn them and the truth disappears. Preserve them, and he's maintaining evidence of his own guilt if the conspiracy fails. There's no good choice, just 2 bad options. He chooses preservation, returns the notes to the medical chest, locks it. The truth exists somewhere, even if it's hidden, even if it can never be used, even if keeping it is more dangerous than destroying it. Thomas can't quite bring himself to erase all connection to reality. That's his weakness, or his integrity. He's not sure which anymore.
The king dies 4 days later, January 14th, 1484. The pneumonia wins despite Thomas's treatments. Edward IV dies at age 40 after 22 years on the throne. His death creates succession crisis. His eldest son is 12 years old, technically king now. But 12-year-old kings need regents. Gloucester is obvious choice, but there are rivals, factions, disputes about who should control the young king and therefore control England. The fight is beginning, and Thomas's ledger is evidence in that fight. Documentation showing Edward was incapacitated for weeks before death, showing he was too sick to make valid decisions, showing that Gloucester's authority as regent wasn't usurpation but necessary response to medical reality.
except the medical reality in the ledger is fiction. Thomas knows this, Gloucester knows this, probably others on the council know this, but everyone with power has interest in maintaining the fiction. The ledger serves their purposes. It justifies decisions they made, legitimizes power they seized, provides documentary basis for continuing control over the young king. Thomas's careful, false entries are now cornerstone of political argument that will determine who rules England. And Thomas is trapped by his own handwriting, can't expose the falsification without exposing himself, can't challenge the conspiracy without destroying himself, can't tell truth without becoming villain rather than victim.
The council requests Thomas testify at formal hearing about the late king's capacity during final weeks. This is legal proceeding. His testimony will be recorded, will become official record, will be cited in histories for centuries. Thomas brings the ledger, swears oath on Bible, testifies that King Edward exhibited daily noon fevers for 6 weeks before his death, testifies that these fevers rendered him incapable of sound judgment during business hours, testifies that Duke of Gloucester's assumption of decision-making authority was medically necessary and appropriate given the king's condition. Every word is lie. Every word is backed by ledger documentation. Every word becomes official truth because Thomas speaks it under oath with medical authority and documentary evidence. He's transformed fiction into history through solemn testimony that will be copied into records consulted by scholars will believe Thomas was faithful physician, honestly documenting his patient's decline. Nobody will know, except Thomas and the conspirators, and maybe God, that the whole thing is elaborate fraud.
The young king is crowned. Edward V, 12 years old. Gloucester is named Lord Protector, regent with full authority until the boy comes of age. The succession crisis seems resolved, but it's not. There are still rivals, still disputes, still people who question whether Gloucester's power grab was legitimate. Thomas's testimony helps. His ledger is cited as proof that the regency was necessary, that Edward IV was too sick to prevent Gloucester's assumption of authority, that the transition was medical necessity, not political conspiracy. The documentation works, the lies serve their purpose, and Thomas has successfully helped install a regime that might not have legitimacy, but has legal foundation provided by his carefully falsified medical records.
He's rewarded, kept on as physician to the new court, given increased salary, praised for his faithful service during difficult transition. Everyone who matters knows what Thomas did, knows he lied under oath, knows he falsified state documents. But everyone who matters benefits from those lies. So Thomas is protected, is valuable, is too compromised to ever be disloyal because his own testimony incriminates him. He's perfect tool. Can't leave, can't oppose, can't testify differently without admitting he committed perjury and treason. He's bound to the conspiracy by his own documentation. That's elegant from Gloucester's perspective. Thomas can be trusted completely because betraying the conspiracy means destroying himself. The ledger he wrote is a chain that binds him to regime he helped create through medical lies.
He continues keeping 2 sets of records. Habit now. Can't break it even though rough notes are more dangerous than ever. The official ledger documents what serves power. The private notes document reality. The 2 versions exist in parallel, one public and false, one hidden and true. Thomas adds entry about how Edward IV actually died. Official ledger says complications from extended fever illness. Private notes say pneumonia, complicated by obesity and age. Both are technically accurate, but one narrative serves the idea that Edward was sick for months before death. Other narrative suggests Edward was relatively healthy until he wasn't. The difference matters politically, even if medically they describe the same death from similar causes. Years pass. Thomas continues serving as court physician. documents what he's told to document, keeps private notes about what he actually observes. The young King Edward V is removed from power after just 3 months, declared illegitimate through questionable legal reasoning. Gloucester becomes King Richard III. The young Edward and his brother disappear into Tower of London, probably murdered, though no bodies are ever found, or at least publicly acknowledged. Thomas documents none of this. His role is medical record-keeping, not political observation. But he knows. Everyone knows. The conspiracy that started with falsified fever documentation has culminated in child murder and usurpation, and Thomas's ledger was first step. His lies about noon fevers justified regent authority that led to seizing throne from 12-year-old. Thomas didn't murder anyone, just wrote false medical records. But those false records were part of chain of events that ended with children disappearing and a usurper crowned.
He thinks about burning the rough notes again, has thought about it hundreds of times, never does it. The notes have become his confession, his acknowledgement that he knew, that somewhere in his documentation he recorded truth, even if he couldn't speak it, that he maintained connection to reality, even while writing fiction. It's inadequate, doesn't absolve him, doesn't change his complicity, but it's something. Small record that Thomas Morley, physician, knew the ledger was false and documented reality somewhere, even if that documentation was hidden and useless. The notes are his only integrity, the only evidence that he didn't completely abandon truth for survival. He keeps them locked in a medical chest, never shows anyone, never will show anyone. They're his burden and his pride simultaneously, evidence of weakness and strength, proof of cowardice and courage. They exist in contradiction, like everything else about Thomas's position.
Richard III rules for 2 years before being killed in battle. Henry Tudor wins the throne, becomes Henry VII, starts new dynasty. Thomas serves the new regime. They know about his role in Richard's rise, could execute him for it. Instead, they keep him. Useful physician who already proved he'll falsify records when politically necessary. That's valuable regardless of who's in power. Thomas understands he'll never be free, will serve whoever rules because his history of compliance makes him safe choice. Can't oppose because opposing would require explaining his past complicity. The ledgers he wrote for Richard bind him to serving Henry just as effectively as they bound him to serving Richard. Documentation doesn't just record past, it determines future. Thomas's past lies ensure his future loyalty because he can't afford for those lies to be exposed. He's permanently trapped by his own handwriting, by the medical records he thought were just administrative duty, but turned out to be political weapons that enslaved him to whoever controls power.
Thomas serves Henry VIII for 12 years, from 1485, when Henry wins the throne, through 1497, when Thomas is 57 and his health fails enough that retirement becomes necessary. Those 12 years teach him that falsification wasn't unique event, wasn't exceptional crisis, was normal operation of how royal medicine works when physicians understand their true function. Henry's court requires same documentation Richard's did, same useful fictions, same strategic recording of symptoms that justify political decisions. Thomas writes what serves power, keeps private notes about reality, maintains parallel documentation that nobody except him knows exists. It's routine now. He's perfected the art of medical lying, can write fiction so smoothly that even he sometimes forgets which version is true.
Henry VII is healthier than Edward IV was, doesn't require as much falsification, but there are still moments when documentation serves politics rather than medicine. When Henry needs to be shown as too ill to meet with hostile ambassadors,
Thomas documents fever. When Henry needs to demonstrate vigour to discourage rebellion, Thomas documents robust health, regardless of Henry's actual condition. The ledgers shape diplomatic reality. Foreign courts make decisions based on English kings' documented health, decide whether to press advantages or hold back based on what Thomas writes in medical records they'll never see, but which get summarised in diplomatic communications. Thomas's lies ripple outward, affect trade negotiations, military planning, marriage alliances. His false documentation of one person's body influences decisions that affect thousands. That's power. Unintended, uncomfortable, but undeniable. Thomas shapes history through lying about fevers.
He destroys the rough notes in 1495. Finally does it. Takes 12 years, but he burns them. Not because he stops caring about truth, because he realizes the notes are too dangerous. If anyone finds them after his death, when he can't explain or defend them, they're evidence of systematic fraud. They prove Thomas knew his official records were false. They incriminate him and potentially everyone he served. Better to destroy the evidence, maintain single version. Let his official documentation stand unchallenged. The burning takes all night. Years of careful observation, hundreds of pages of truthful notes about royal health, all turned to ash. Thomas watches them burn. Feels like he's destroying last connection to the physician he thought he was before he learned what being royal physician actually meant. The truth goes up in smoke. Only the lies remain, preserved in official ledgers that will be copied and stored and consulted and believed. That's fitting. Truth is temporary. Documentation is permanent. And documentation that serves power is most permanent of all.
Thank you for staying with me through this difficult exploration of how documentation corrupts, how medicine serves politics, how individuals become complicit in conspiracies through small choices that accumulate into careers of lying. If this changed how you think about official records, about medical documentation, about the relationship between truth and power, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your reflections. What modern professions face similar pressures? Where do you see documentation being weaponized? How do people maintain integrity in positions that require lying? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on these questions that have no good answers. Thomas retires in 1497, leaves court, returns to private practice in London, treats regular people. Their documentation is simpler, doesn't carry political weight, can be honest again, can write what he observes without considering how it might be used against them, or for them, or by them. It's relief, but also hollow, because Thomas knows now that all documentation is political. Even treating merchant's cough, the record of that treatment could matter in guild disputes, or inheritance arguments, or criminal proceedings. Nothing is neutral once it's written. Every note is potential evidence. Every observation is potential weapon. Thomas can't unknow this, can't return to innocent belief that medical records are just medical records. They're always more, always potentially more. And recognizing that possibility means Thomas can never fully be honest again, even when there's no obvious reason to lie. The corruption is permanent, not in what he writes, but in how he thinks about writing, in the calculations that happen automatically, in the awareness that truth is just one option among many when deciding what to document.
He writes memoir in his final years, private document never meant for publication. Tries to explain how he became person who falsified state medical records and helped usurper seize throne. Tries to trace the steps, the small decisions that led to large complicity. Tries to understand at what point he crossed line from victim to participant, from someone being used to someone choosing to be used. The memoir is defensive,
justifying, full of explanations about how he had no choice, about how anyone in his position would have done the same, about how survival required compromise, about how maintaining integrity would have meant death. All probably true, also all insufficient, because whatever Thomas's reasons, the results remain. Children died, power was seized, truth was buried, and Thomas's lies were part of how that happened. The memoir doesn't reconcile this, ends without resolution, just trails off into descriptions of regrets and justifications that cancel each other out without producing understanding or absolution.
Thomas dies in 1502 at age 62. The memoir is found among his papers by his son, who reads it with horror, realizes his father wasn't the faithful physician family legends described, but complicit fraud who helped murderer seize throne. The son burns the memoir, doesn't want the family name associated with treachery, doesn't want Thomas's confession to become historical record, destroys the only document where Thomas tried to tell truth about his role. So Thomas's deathbed honesty is lost, just like his rough notes were lost, just like all his attempts to maintain connection to truth were lost. Only the lies survive. The official ledgers, the sworn testimony, the documented medical records that historians will cite as authentic observation by professional physician. Thomas's falsehoods outlive his attempts at truth. That's how documentation works. Useful lies get preserved. Inconvenient truths get destroyed. And centuries later, historians will read Thomas's ledgers and believe them because they're official documents created by credentialed professional with no apparent reason to fabricate. They won't know about the secret fevers, about the noon temperatures that never existed, about the systematic falsification that helped usurper seize throne. They'll just see careful medical records and cite them as evidence about how Edward IV died and why Richard III's regency was justified, and what Henry VII inherited. The documentation will tell story that Thomas wrote knowing it was false, but which becomes true through persistence and citation and historical distance from anyone who knew otherwise.
The pattern Thomas participated in didn't end with him. Royal physicians continue serving similar functions, continue documenting what serves power rather than what's medically accurate, continue being trapped between medicine and politics with no good way to maintain both integrity and position. The documentation continues mattering more than health. The records continue being weapons. The physicians continue being political actors, whether they want to be or not. Thomas's particular lies are unique to his time, but the system that required those lies is a permanent feature of how power works. Someone has to document the king's health. That documentation matters politically. Whoever does the documenting faces pressure to serve political needs. Whoever faces that pressure must choose between truth and survival. Most choose survival. That's not a unique failure. That structural problem with making physicians responsible for politically significant documentation. Can't solve it by finding more ethical physician. Can only solve it by changing the system that requires physician to lie. And nobody changes the system because everyone with power benefits from physicians who lie usefully. The ledgers Thomas created survive, not the originals. Those were lost or destroyed in various upheavals, but copies exist, transcriptions made by clerks who were creating comprehensive archives of royal documents. Thomas's entries about Edward IV's final weeks appear in historical collections, get cited in scholarly works, get used as evidence in historical debates about Richard III's usurpation and whether he murdered the princes in the Tower and how legitimate his rule was. Thomas's lies become historical truth, get repeated in books, get taught in universities, get accepted as authentic documentation of medical reality. Historians might note that Thomas served Richard III afterward, and therefore might have had reason to falsify records to support Richard's regency, but they have no proof. The rough notes are gone, the memoir is gone. All contrary evidence is destroyed. Only the official documentation remains, and official documentation has authority that speculation can't overcome. Thomas's ledgers are believed because they're written by credentialed professional with official position, documenting observations in systematic way, using appropriate medical terminology. They look authentic because they are authentic. They're just authentically false. But nobody can prove falseness after Thomas is dead, and everyone who knew about conspiracy is dead, and 500 years have passed. So the lies become history, get set in stone, get repeated forever, because they're written and preserved and official.
Modern historians examining these records sometimes express puzzlement. The documentation shows perfect pattern of daily noon fevers that seems almost too consistent. Medical reality is usually messier, but they explain this away as Thomas using contemporary medical theory to impose order on chaotic symptoms, as Thomas documenting what humoral theory predicted should happen rather than exactly what he observed, as normal medieval practice of fitting observation to theory. They're not entirely wrong. Medieval physicians did often document what theory said should happen rather than what actually happened. But in Thomas's case, the falsification was more deliberate than that, was conscious conspiracy to create specific political narrative, wasn't medical theory shaping observation, but political need shaping documentation. The historians get close to truth, but don't quite reach it, because they can't imagine level of systematic fraud that Thomas participated in. They assume physicians are mostly honest, even when influenced by incorrect theory. Don't consider that physicians might be completely dishonest when influenced by political pressure and self-preservation. That failure of imagination means Thomas's lies remain effective 500 years after he wrote them.
The secret fever, Thomas noted, wasn't medical, was political, was discovery that the documentation he thought was neutral recording of health was actually political weapon being wielded to justify power seizure. That discovering this secret and learning to participate in it was how Thomas survived, how he prospered, how he stayed employed across regime changes, how he became valuable to whoever held throne. The fever was fiction that served function, was useful lie, was documentation that created reality rather than recording it. And Thomas learned to note it carefully, to record it systematically, to make it believable through consistency and medical terminology and sworn testimony. The step-by-step process wasn't medical observation, was political participation, was slow corruption of a physician into a fraud, was education in how documentation works when power needs something documented that isn't true.
The night when Thomas discovered the falsification was a pivot point. Could have reported it, could have refused to continue, could have chosen truth over survival. He chose survival. That choice determined everything after, made him complicit, made him valuable, made him trapped, made him successful by every measure except integrity. The documentation he created that night and every night after determined throne of England more surely than armies or noble bloodlines or legal arguments, because his documentation became the legal arguments, became the evidence cited in succession disputes, became the historical record that justified or condemned, depending on what Thomas wrote. That's enormous power for one physician's handwriting to wield. Thomas never wanted that power, but he learned to use it, learned to serve whoever needed his lies, learned that documentation is weapon, and physicians who control medical documentation are warriors in political battles they didn't choose but can't avoid. That's what the secret fever reveals. Not just about Thomas or Richard III or 15th century England, about how documentation always works when it matters politically, about how records create reality rather than reflecting it, about how people who control documentation control truth in ways that outlast any individual's memory or objection.
Thomas's story is ultimately about how impossible it is to maintain integrity in positions where documentation has political weight, where being honest means being destroyed, where being useful requires being dishonest, where survival means writing fiction and calling it fact. Thomas wasn't uniquely weak, wasn't unusually corrupt, was normal physician facing impossible choice between medicine and politics, and finding that there was no way to practice medicine without serving politics. That's structural problem, not individual failing. The system required Thomas to lie, rewarded him for lying, protected him as long as lies were useful, destroyed him if he told truth. In system like that, integrity is a luxury most people can't afford. Thomas couldn't afford it, chose survival instead, chose complicity instead, chose documentation that served power instead of truth. That's not noble, also not surprising. It's how systems that monetize documentation maintain themselves, by making honesty impossible, by making lying necessary, by making everyone who participates in documentation become liar whether they want to be or not, by making the lies permanent through careful record-keeping, while making truth temporary through destroying evidence and killing witnesses and letting time erase memory, until only documentation remains, and documentation says whatever served power at moment it was written.
The winter ledgers Thomas maintained weren't unique. Thousands of physicians across centuries have maintained similar ledgers, have faced similar pressures, have made similar choices, have documented what served power rather than what was medically accurate. The mechanism is reliable. Put physician in position where documentation matters politically, create pressure to serve political needs, reward compliance, punish resistance, wait for physician to calculate that survival requires lying, collect the documentation, use it to justify whatever power needs justified. The physicians become complicit, become trapped, become unable to testify differently later because they're trapped by their own earlier documentation. It's elegant system, self-enforcing. Physicians police themselves because their past lies make future honesty impossible. Thomas understood this by the end, understood that his first false entry trapped him into writing all subsequent false entries, understood that documentation is a chain that binds you to whatever you documented, even if you documented it under duress or with reservation, or while knowing it was false. What's written becomes what you're committed to defending, because contradicting your own written testimony makes you look either incompetent or dishonest. Either way, it destroys your credibility. Better to maintain the lies, stand by the false documentation, defend the fiction you created. That's how physicians become permanent political actors, through their own handwriting creating obligations they can never escape. The ledgers teach this lesson across centuries, teach that documentation isn't neutral, teach that record-keeping is political act, teach that physicians who document politically significant bodies can't just practice medicine, must practice politics, must understand that their medical observations will be used for purposes beyond healing, must calculate what to write based on how it might be used rather than what's medically accurate, must become liars or refuse positions where lying is required, and refusing those positions means giving up status, income, influence. Most people don't refuse. Most people become Thomas Morley, become careful documenters of useful fictions, become complicit in conspiracies they didn't initiate but learn to serve, become trapped by their own handwriting into permanent loyalty to whoever currently holds power, because betraying that power would require exposing their own past lies. That's how quiet justice works, through medical documentation. Not through dramatic crimes, but through systematic falsification of routine records. Not through violence, but through lying about noon temperatures. Not through obvious conspiracy, but through normal professional practice that happens to serve political rather than medical purposes. The fever is noted carefully in the ledger. The ledger becomes evidence in succession dispute.
the physician becomes kingmaker without ever drawing sword or making speech, or doing anything except writing careful lies night after night until the lies accumulate into political reality that determines who rules and who's executed and who's forgotten and who's remembered as legitimate.
Thomas's particular conspiracy is documented in history books as Richard III's usurpation. Historians know Richard seized throne through questionable means, know he probably murdered his nephews, know his rule was contested. What they don't fully know is role that medical documentation played, how Thomas Morley's ledgers provided legal foundation for Richard's regency, how those ledgers were cited in councils and hearings and diplomatic communications as proof that Edward IV was incapacitated and Richard's authority was necessary, how systematic falsification of routine medical records became cornerstone of political argument that justified everything that followed. The historians see the results, Richard as king, the princes disappeared, but miss the mechanism, the quiet bureaucratic process through which lies in ledgers became political reality. That mechanism is what matters. That mechanism is what persists. That mechanism is what operates today in different contexts, with different technologies, but identical logic. Document what serves power. Make the documentation systematic and believable and official. Use it as evidence in disputes where documentation matters more than truth. Trap the documenters through their own handwriting so they can't testify differently later. Preserve the documentation while destroying contrary evidence. Let time make the lies into history. That's the pattern Thomas participated in. That's the pattern that continues everywhere documentation has political weight, and physicians or scientists or administrators or anyone with credentialed authority is asked to note what power needs noted, regardless of what truth would require noting instead.
The step-by-step process Thomas followed that winter night wasn't medical, was political awakening, was discovery that documentation outlives truth, was education in how record-keeping creates reality, was realization that his position required lying, was choice to survive through complicity rather than die through integrity. That process repeats everywhere similar pressures exist. Someone notices documentation is false. Someone has a night of reckoning about what that means. Someone chooses continuation over confrontation. Someone becomes complicit through documentation they create knowing it's false. Someone becomes trapped by their own handwriting. Someone becomes permanent servant of whoever holds power because past lies make future resistance impossible. That's the mechanism. That's how it works. Step by step, night by night, entry by entry, until the documentation is so extensive and so false and so incriminating that the person who created it can never escape it, can never testify differently, can never choose integrity without destroying themselves. That's what Thomas learned. That's what the secret fever teaches, that noting carefully what power needs noted is path to survival and complicity and permanent compromise, that the winter ledgers outlive the loudest accusations, because accusations are temporary noise, while ledgers are permanent documentation, that medical records matter more than medical reality when records are being used politically, that physicians who understand this can prosper, that physicians who don't understand it can't survive in positions where understanding is required, that the king's doctor noting a secret fever in winter ledgers, step by step, through long night, his story about documentation as power and power as documentation, and how the two become inseparable until you can't tell which is creating which, and you just know that what's written determines what's believed, and what's believed determines who rules, and who dies, and whose.
Remembered as legitimate, and who's forgotten as traitor. The fever was secret, the notation was careful, the ledger was false, the consequences were permanent. And Thomas Morley, physician, who started career trying to heal, ended it having helped murderer seize throne through careful lies about noon temperatures. That's the legacy. That's the pattern. That's what persists in archives, where his ledgers can still be read by people who believe them.
because they're written in physicians' careful hand, using appropriate medical terminology, documenting observations that never happened, but that look authentic enough to fool historians 500 years later. The secret fever outlived everyone who knew it was secret, became accepted medical history, became foundation for political arguments, became truth through persistence and documentation and time. That's power. That's how quiet justice works, through notes in ledgers that outlive accusations and witnesses and memory, and everyone except the marks themselves, which persist forever, saying whatever power needed said at moment they were written.